Good evening, everyone, and a very warm welcome to Pathways to Equitable Food Systems. I'm Melissa Leach. I'm Director of the Institute of Development Studies, where we've worked on a big variety of food-related issues for many years, as well as a member of the International Panel of Experts on Sustainable Food Systems. And it's a real pleasure to join everyone here in this room at the Photographers Gallery here in London, as well as to see all the people who've joined us online. I'm delighted to open up this event where we're launching a new report from IDS called Pathways to Equitable Food Systems, as well as hearing insights from the Committee on World Food Security's high-level panel on food security and nutrition, which launched a very important report just last week. We'll then go into a panel discussion where we have a number of fantastic experts from around the world. We'll have plenty of time, I hope, for questions from the audience. So for those of you joining us online, please do post your questions into the chat, and we'll do our best to get through just as many of them as we possibly can. But firstly, a reminder of why we're here. Food systems, as many of you will be acutely aware, are failing many, many people around the world. Hunger, which for many decades was on the decline, is once again on the rise, with over 800 million people going hungry in the world. Even more than that, over 1 billion people are living with obesity and all its attendant health and social implications, thanks in no small part to the increase of ultra-processed foods in diets. Hunger and diet-linked non-communicable diseases are really two sides of the same coin. These challenges aren't just confined to lower middle income countries or the so-called global south, not at all. Here in the UK, one of the richest countries in the world, new data out just last week shows the extent of child stunting, driven by worsening diets. Nor is this a story of production. There's enough food being produced in the world. In fact, some experts say that there's even enough food produced today to feed the 10 billion people that we expect will be living on our planet in 2050. It's not a production problem. It's not a quantity problem. Rather, the fundamental problem is about access. And it's about the huge inequities in food systems that mean that some people have plenty, perhaps even too much, whilst others simply can't get access to healthy, affordable food. It's also about power, about who controls food systems and the food environments that so often close down on people's choices. Who are most affected by these issues? Why are they happening? And absolutely crucially, what can be done about it? That's what we're here tonight to discuss. To get us started, I'd like to hand over in a minute to my colleague Lidia Cabral, who is a research fellow at IDS, who's going to present the key findings from the report. But before we do that, let's just watch a short video which will introduce what we mean by food equity and why at IDS we think it's so important.
Food systems are steeped in inequity. A fruit farm worker in South Africa goes hungry after the harvest. She is out of work and gets no support from the welfare system. A Zambian woman suffers from obesity, her diet changing as companies promote more processed food. In Myanmar, disease outbreak threatens a pig farmer's livelihood. Government responses neglect systemic issues such as poor veterinary health care. And in Brazil, government-subsidized soybean producers are expanding, driving local farmers from their territory. Food systems have become disconnected from people. Vested interests protect the status quo, preventing deep-rooted change. Governments prioritize production over the needs of those most vulnerable. After decades of improvement, global hunger is again on the rise. At the same time, our diets are becoming less healthy and less nutritious. Our research shows that people from marginalized backgrounds often go hungry, have unhealthy diets, and are exploited by these systems. We urgently need to change course. This is why we established the Food Equity Center, a global research network. Our aim: to push back against injustices and develop pathways to more equitable food systems.
Hope you enjoyed the video. Good evening, everyone, and good afternoon or good morning to those joining online. It's a pleasure to be here to share some of the findings from the report that we're launching today. So I'll touch on the broad messages, but please read the report for the details. I hope you enjoy it. So I'm one of 5 co-authors of this report, where we synthesized our own work, as well as the work that we've developed with several colleagues at IDS and with partners around the world. So the report is a very collective effort that draws on a range of research projects, themes, and experiences from across the globe. Our aim with this report was to shed light on the pervasive inequities of food systems around the world and discuss pathways to address them. And by inequities, we mean the systemic disadvantages facing certain individuals or social groups, which call for more than small incremental changes or corrective measures. We're talking really about transformative change to address these inequities. Just waiting for the slide to accompany my words. The next slide, you can see the beautiful cover of our report, so you can move to that one. And then I'm going to highlight now 4 areas of inequity that we talked about in the report. So we can go to the next slide, please. And the number 1 is about the persistence of hunger alongside an obesity epidemic, abundance, and food waste, as Melissa was talking about. And how can we accept this to happen in the 21st century? How come we're still facing this problem? In Brazil today, 33 million people are in a situation of hunger, despite the country being one of the agricultural world powers, a leading exporter and producer of agricultural commodities. And here in the UK, there are over 2,000 food banks continuing to expand in response to the ongoing cost of living crisis and rising poverty that last year affected just under 10 million people. How can this be acceptable? The number 2 inequity that we highlight relates to diets and nutrition. Research into malnutrition and undernutrition often focuses on the individual nutrients, missing the wider issue of how and why people get unhealthy diets and the social and economic determinants that shape those diets, being healthcare, education, upbringing, where people come from, where they live, and so on. Number 3 inequity that we emphasize relates to territories. Let me take you to the favelas of Rio de Janeiro, authentic food deserts, where people lack access to fresh food and the space to grow their own food, often having to do it in pavements and rely on self-help networks that gather together people in similar conditions of marginalization. How can this happen in Brazil today? Number 4 inequity relates to food system livelihoods. In many countries, food system livelihoods are the main source of employment and income. We're talking not just about farming, but many other activities which are often invisible.
Take a look at the photo on the cover of our report. Very beautiful, colorful photo. But what you see there is informal vendors in markets, in this case in the Kumasi Central Market in Ghana. Many of these women in conditions of precarious work, without any form of labor rights and facing discrimination. How can this happen? So in the report, we discuss why these inequities are so pervasive, why they remain in place. Next slide, please. We emphasize that power imbalances are behind these inequities, as Melissa was saying before, and this is what makes these inequities so hard to eliminate. It's pretty well established that food systems have reached concerning levels of corporate concentration at all levels, from technological innovation to food production and retailing. This corporate concentration is associated with farming practices that are obsessed with efficiency gains or yields and profit margins, but are often environmentally unsustainable and socially unjust. Corporate concentration also enables unhealthy diets dominated by processed foods, while putting the blame on consumer choice. Powerful groups we emphasize in the report get to shape the narrative and policy direction. In recent years, there's been a hype about regenerative farming, nature-based solutions, much of which is being driven by big agri-food corporations. We question whether the sustainability agenda behind these labels is being greenwashed and appropriated by these narratives, brushing aside concerns with social justice and equity. So in the report, we make some recommendations moving forward, and this is the next slide, please. And our recommendations are guided by the Pathways to Sustainability approach developed by Melissa Leach, Ian Schoons, other colleagues at IDS and the University of Sussex. And their approach recognizes that different people from different standpoints understand systems in different ways. So when thinking about pathways to sustainable futures, we need to consider for these, what directions are different pathways headed in, whether there is sufficient diversity in those pathways, what implications for distribution in terms of who the winners and who the losers are in relation to particular pathways chosen, and what implications for democracy in terms of voice and inclusion. So our equity perspective and our food equity angle calls for attention to be given to those perspectives and standpoints that are systematically on pathways. So we recommend 4 things. More emphasis should be placed on bringing together community and government level actions to target food inequities. Multiple approaches to tackle inequities should be pursued, going beyond small increments, narrow technical fixes that cannot address those systemic disadvantages. Third, attention should be given to inequities in distribution of wealth and opportunities, favoring those policies that explicitly support those who are marginalized. And finally, giving voice to those experiences inequalities firsthand. And on this note, I wanted to end with an inspiring quote from Sonia Guajajara, who comes from the Araribaya indigenous land in the Amazon rainforest. And Guajajara has recently become the first ever indigenous person leading the newly created Ministry for Indigenous Peoples in the Brazilian government. And these are her words that I want to leave you with. Quote, "Now we have ourselves alone. We want to be the protagonists of our history, having us as our spokespeople with no intermediaries." Thank you.
Lidia, thank you so much. And as Lidia said, this is only a smattering, an outline. The detail, the evidence, and a lot of relevant case studies are there in the report. So please do have a read. So I want now to turn to Professor Christina Hicks, who is a professor in the Political Ecology Group in the Environment Centre at Lancaster University. And she is a member of the UN Committee on World Food Security's high-level panel of experts on food security and nutrition. She is a co-author of the report I mentioned that was released just last week, entitled Reducing Inequalities for Food Security and Nutrition. So highly relevant to our topic tonight, and I think a really interesting complement to the IDS report. So Christina, over to you to share what's there in your report.
Thank you very much, and thanks for having me here today. For those of you who don't know, the High-Level Panel Committee on World Food Security is the UN body tasked with synthesizing the evidence on food and nutrition, food security and nutrition. It receives its mandate from the Committee on Food Security and assembles a group of authors and a steering committee to cover this work. Next slide, please. So the work I'm going to represent is on behalf of a team of authors led by Bhavani, including Nick, and the work happens in a specified time frame. So we've only just finished, and I'm going to try and squeeze in what we've been working on through the past year into the next few minutes. Next, please. So we were tasked with two key questions. First, establishing how inequalities within food systems impede opportunities to overcome food security, and secondly, establishing what the drivers of inequities were and then entry points for change. So implicit in this was the recognition that inequalities hamper progress in addressing food security, but there are also a number of other reasons why this work was identified as important. There are moral and ethical reasons. There are practical reasons. Inequalities exacerbate social and environmental harms. And also there are legal reasons. We've made commitments to, for example, leave no one behind. Next, please. So in addressing this work, we wanted to identify what we consider inequalities and inequities. And so we took inequalities to be the observed differences in food and nutrition security outcomes. So addressing the first ask from the Committee for Food Security. Inequities, we are defined as when these inequalities were the result of socially, economically, or political reasons. So inequities really gets at the why these unequal differences emerge. Next, please. So for those of you who are aware of the food system, it brings together all elements of so actors, institutions, inputs, as well as activities that result in the production, distribution, processing, and consumption of food. So we took this as the structure for our report. Next, please. And each of our chapters addressed a key component. So after establishing the concepts, the second and third chapters looked at the inequalities, both in food security and nutrition outcomes, as well as in the proximate drivers, so the other aspects of the food system. The fourth chapter looked at what the underlying distal drivers of change were, so those getting at those elements of inequity. Chapters 5 and 6 began to develop action and recommendations that would then go back to the World Committee on Food Security and hopefully influence policy actions. Next, please. So to conceptualize our work, we drew on a body of literature that I'm sure many of you are aware of here, for example, the Food Equity Framework, as well as the underlying theoretical literature, for example, by John Rawls and Nancy Fraser on injustices. And our starting point was, if we do want to improve food security and nutrition outcomes for all, then we need to understand the inequalities that exist both within the food system and in other systems, and how they harm the pillars of food security. Next. But for sustained change in improving outcomes, we really need to get at understanding the systemic drivers of inequity. Next, maybe the next two. And all of this needs to take into consideration intersectional, intergenerational, and interterritorial dimensions of equity. So addressing inequities and improving outcomes, so in addressing inequities and improving outcomes, we need to get at these core aspects of the engine that drive these inequalities. We need to consider the recognitional dimension, so thinking about historical reasons for why inequities converge and who they harm. Redistributive dimensions, ensuring everyone has access to equal assets, and representational dimensions, ensuring everyone, in particular the most marginalized, are represented. Next, please. So just picking up on some of the key findings. So similar to the IDS report, we found that large, consistent, and often increasingly unequal outcomes exist, both across and within all regions, including in high-income countries and across the whole food system. These inequalities are intersectional, but there was insufficient data to really characterize this intersectionality sufficiently. We found that context shapes these inequalities, but there are certain patterns. Women, for example, those with less formal education, Indigenous people, poor people in regions, and smaller scale producers are persistently affected. And inequalities in areas beyond the food system, such as the education and health systems, contribute to inequalities in food security and nutrition outcomes. Next slide. Looking at the distal drivers, or the systemic drivers of these outcomes, we found that inequalities are underpinned by these systemic drivers. And these systemic drivers widen pre-existing inequalities, making those most vulnerable more vulnerable. But they also create harmful feedbacks, for example, between environmental systems and food systems. And so it's necessary for these feedbacks to be broken. Historically and currently, economic drivers have been shown to increasingly consolidate ownership through flows of finance and trade and power, while inequalities and constraining food security and nutrition. And policies are often siloed, so they don't work across sectors, and this constrains the ability to address inequities and not exacerbate inequities in addressing one solution. Next, please. So in developing the actions, what we want people to do, we identified a number of principles that should apply to all actions. So actions should be focused on intersectional inequalities. We need transformative policies to move beyond these incremental changes. We need rights-based approaches that put people at the heart of change. Distributive policies on their own are inefficient. We need policies that are based on recognition and representation. We need to draw on diverse knowledges and data, consider cumulative impacts. Policies need to be grounded in context and shared responsibility. So we produced a range of actions for the CFS directed to various actors at the NGOs, civil society, as well as governments that you can dig into further in the report. And I'll just quickly run through the overarching high level of them, but you can dig deeper into the report. Maybe if you want to keep going, please. And these include actions that tackle inequalities within food systems, that tackle inequalities within related systems, that tackle social and political drivers in inequality, and that strengthen data and knowledge systems to enable improved understanding and monitoring. For each of these, we evaluated the extent to which they address recognitional, representational, or distributional dimensions of inequity, to guide policymakers in ensuring that their actions are not concentrated on just one form of injustice, which can then move towards an equity-sensitive policymaking, where policies are grounded in recognitional dimensions, representational dimensions, and redistributional dimensions. Thank you very much. I'll end there. And as you can see, there's lots of different people who've contributed to the report in terms of the Oversight Committee, as well as the core team.
Thank you so much. That was fascinating. And again, another really interesting and important and timely report. So I'm now going to hand over to Professor Nick Nisbet, who's another of my IDS colleagues. He's a fellow in our health and nutrition cluster. And he's going to introduce and then share a discussion with our online international panel with those in the room and also the questions that have come forward from our audiences. So Nick, over to you.
Thank you so much, Melissa. So Anna and Graham, would you like to take your seats alongside me here? Gary, are we sharing? Brilliant. Thank you. Okay, yeah. Fantastic. So I hope you can hear me okay online. And just checking. Gary, are we going to be able to see Lillian and Gareth?
Yeah, I'll put it on gallery view.
Brilliant. So thank you so much, Christina. Thank you so much, Lidia. That was a really nice introduction to the two reports. And what we're going to do in this session is start to explore some of the complementarities between the two reports, but also start to think about areas for action. So we've assembled here some experts in inequality, inequity, policy, but also pathways to transformational change, both globally and regionally. I'm really pleased to introduce to my left, Anna Taylor, the Executive Director of the Food Foundation, Graham Gordon, the Head of Public Policy in CAFOD, and on the screen we have Belay, who's the co-founder and coordinator of the Alliance for Food Sovereignty in Africa, and also Gareth Haysom, who's Senior Researcher at the African Centre for Cities at the University of Cape Town, and also a partner in the Food Benefit Centre. So I'm going to start with an initial question, which is to all the speakers. I'll start with you, Anna, if that's okay. And I'm going to ask you just to give a brief response to what you've heard about the two reports. I'm sure you haven't had time to read them. But just in the sense of how the types of inequities that are analysed in the two reports, how do they play out in your own areas of work? So starting with Anna, thanks very much for I'll pass this over.
Thanks, Nick. Great to be here. Nice to meet you all. So I was listening to the presentations very much from a UK perspective. So the Food Foundation is a UK-based charity, and we're working on trying to change the food system in the UK so that it makes it easier for everybody to eat well. So from both the health and the sustainability perspective. And we've got a particular focus on ensuring that the food system delivers more equitable outcomes, because at the moment we have huge amounts of food inequity built into the system here in the UK. And in fact, today we actually launched our annual, fortuitous on the day-to-day, we're launching our annual report called The Broken Plate, which basically provides a sort of snapshot of the state of the UK's food system and its impact on our health. And throughout that report, it tells the story of huge amounts of inequality baked into the UK food system. So whether it's starting from the affordability of food, so if you're on the poorest 20% of households in Britain, you need to spend 50% of your disposable income in order to be able to afford a diet that meets the dietary standards recommended by the Department of Health, through to the price of healthy calories being double that of unhealthy calories, through to the knock-on impacts on health outcomes in the UK, where we have really pronounced inequalities in a whole range of outcomes, whether it's dental caries amongst children, childhood obesity, diabetes, and of course, perhaps most staggering, we now have between 18 and 19 years of healthy life expectancy difference between the most deprived parts of the country and the least deprived. So we have a system at the moment that makes it really, if you've got very little money, makes it even harder for you to eat well. And when I was hearing about the, well, it's very interesting, the sort of conversation about power in the first report, and really thinking about how corporate power plays out here in the UK. And we have a very consolidated retail sector that is essentially the gatekeeper to the vast majority of what is eaten in the UK. And therefore, all of our work really is about trying to explain in multiple different ways why citizens' sort of agency is so limited and removed by the environments in which we're making decisions about what we eat. And actually, we need policies that enable people to have more agency so that the healthy choices which are not as hard to make as they currently are, particularly for people on the low income. On the second bit, the second report, I was interested in the points about the different ways in which we can tackle those headings of, I'm not going to get them all, redistribution, representation, and the third one, recognition. I was trying to think about those out in the UK. We do a lot of work with, we do a lot of kind of more academic type analysis, but we try and always couple it with giving profile to, we have a panel of food ambassadors, young people and adults who have experiences of food insecurity and are able to bring we try and create opportunities for them to speak directly to policymakers and big businesses about how the food system plays out in their lives and why these inequalities are so persistent. So it's in a small way, what we're trying to do is to sort of create a space for citizens directly to have a little bit of power and have their voices heard in some of those contexts where they're normally fairly excluded. You don't have to start with.
Next, okay. Thanks. Hi. So I'm working for CAFOD. For those of you who don't know, it's the Catholic it used to be Catholic Agency for Overseas Development. So it's Caritas England and Wales, and we work in about 30 countries around the world through local partners. So I've skimmed both reports, and there's so much in them. I encourage you all to read them. But maybe a couple of things to pick out, which I thought really chimed with the experiences we have with working with our partners around the world. From the second report, I think looking at some of the additional systemic issues that drive inequality is something that we've really seen in many areas we work. So, for example, we work in Zambia, and issues of land ownership, particularly the lack of ability for many women to own land as it's passed down through men, is a huge issue in terms of access to participating in the food system or access to finance, access to technological input. And this lack of voice or access to resources that women have is more reinforced than in the case of men, but in that case, we still see it very clearly. So, for example, I was visiting one of our programs in Gokwe in the south, and all of the farmers, or most of them, are reliant on maize. And this was 2019 when I visited, and I saw 2 failed maize harvests. And what happened was that despite an agricultural policy that gives farmers access to a variety of crops, a variety of livestock, organic and inorganic fertilizers, all that the extension workers provided was maize with the attached chemical fertilizers, and they only provided those inputs once the rains had started and the soils had already been, they were 10 degrees warmer, some of the soils, due to the way methods of farming, and they just didn't retain the moisture, and once planted it was too late. And so that compared to some of the other methods where we see in the local communities who had the kind of agri-ecological methods, who had just diverse farming methods, they had access to different inputs. They'd also had groups working with them around savings, around tackling gender-based violence and equitable decision-making. So you could see differences, but actually the predominant system provided from the government at that time was just following an intensified industrial agricultural model for export and for consumption that wasn't serving the needs of the local people. And interestingly, when COVID hit in Zambia, the president introduced various laws. Suddenly he said, from now on, I want to see, I don't want to see South African food on Zambian shelves, I want to see Zambian food on Zambian shelves. And he introduced various laws to remove the import duties on farm machinery, to encourage the development of cooperatives. It's actually an interesting example where policies can make a huge difference if they're implemented. So I think that's part of the reality. And if we've got time for another example, what I was really struck by in the IDS report was that many of the responses not only focus on individuals and ignore the systemic injustices, but also reinforce the problems that are actually causing the inequalities in the first place. And I think if we look at the responses we've seen to global food prices in 2007-8 or in East Africa in 2017-18 and the recent food prices that we see in East Africa, then the responses are actually repeating the same issues and reinforcing the power, the control and the power dynamics that have been at the cause of the problem in the first place. So speaking with UK government, speaking with many donors, the World Bank, the rush has been when prices go up in East Africa to find new supplies of fertilizer, new supplies of grain. This was when Russia invaded Ukraine, because suddenly those supplies were blocked, therefore we need some new supplies. And then these new supplies are found without actually recognizing that this was the same response to the 2007-8 crisis, reinforcing a model of industrial agriculture. That means that in Kenya, in Somalia, in South Sudan, communities that are reliant on one crop, they're reliant on the fossil fuel-based chemical fertilizers, are susceptible, A, to price rises, they're susceptible to climate change, and they're susceptible to global food shortages as well. And actually, the World Bank has done some analysis that shows that most of over the last 50 or 60 years, the food prices have followed a similar pattern. Energy price rises leading to fertilizer price rises, leading to food price rises, leading to hunger. Yet the same model is repeated, the same answers. We need to immediately get more food, we need to get more fertilizers, and we need to kind of help get the staple crops, the calorie-based crops, without then thinking about how to diversify food systems. And so I think that recognition in the IDS report of the, I think, inequality blind interventions is really what we've seen throughout our work. And governments recognize it, but governments, in my experience, have then not had the space or time to think beyond the next crisis and think about how you need more fundamental reform of the system.
Thank you so much, Graham, and there's some nice resonance there with work in Zambia and in the UK already. So I'm going to turn now to, I think I might take Gareth next, because I think Gareth's internet connection is a little bit unstable. So while we still see you on the screen, Gareth, we'd love to hear your thoughts as well.
So thanks, Nick, and thank you so much to everyone and for being able to be here, even if it is from a very cold tip of Southern Africa. For me, what was really interesting in the report were, there was two things perhaps is probably best just to bring them out at this point in time, was the work that's increasingly confounding us in South Africa around this work is, and I think perhaps many other sort of African and South Asian countries, is the notion of a second urban transition. So we're moving into cities without the industrial employment, without the jobs, etc. And this urbanization process is resulting in large-scale informality and a system that the sort of policy architecture isn't really designed to respond to. So for me, what was particularly interesting about the IDS report and in the HLPE report was this, the importance given to related systems. And so not just to focus vehemently on the food system, but also on these connected systems across a whole set of areas and how that connected into the questions of distribution, representation, and how society in South Africa particularly, and equally in a lot of countries in Africa with a sort of colonial sort of legacy, how the food system was never designed to be an equitable and wellness providing system. It was designed to be a pacifying system. And the maize, you talk about the maize and the centering of maize and things like that, how these staple crops were brought in to enable sort of maximum extraction. The Pate, who is part of some of our working groups, looked at this to prevent food rights and those type of issues. And so trying to think through how this landscape creates this map of inequality and how one engages in these inequities, not just in terms of inequities in terms of food access. South Africa and many countries have very high levels of food insecurity, but at the same time, as was mentioned in the introduction, rising levels of obesity and type 2 diabetes and relatedly. And I think for us, what I saw quite often in this report was trying to challenge how the slow violence of our histories is not being addressed in the current policy regimes. So South Africa, as with many other countries, effectively follow what would be termed a twin track approach. Grow more food, as Melissa said, and that increased food would reduce the costs of food and enable access. And this is not taking place. So the rise of ultra-processed foods and these in our country is systematic. The inability to engage policy when, for example, the urban system and the food system connect. So what happens when infrastructure is at a high cost, when energy is so expensive that 2-minute noodles are the pragmatic choice rather than traditional grains, because it just takes so quick to cook. And this is how that system has come to be. And so for me, both reports speak to is this notion of a just transition in the food system, both in the urban and other spaces. And I think for us, what the call for sort of highly transformative policies, things that we've been calling for a long time, far greater recognition and representation in the policy space, embracing diverse knowledges, all of these components, and specifically the importance of context are borne out in both the reports. And I think for us, there was this really useful synergy in terms of these that spoke to the work that we've been doing that hasn't been reaching the ear of the policymakers, certainly in the spaces we've been operating. So let me leave it at that and pass on, because I think Million has similar challenges of policy deafness, but perhaps something very different from their perspective.
Thank you so much. So I'm going to move on to Million, and I'm going to ask you to comment on the reports, but I also had a specific question that I wanted to move on to as well for you. So both reports highlight the importance of learning from and transitioning to more agroecologically focused food systems and embedding the governance of such systems democratically in different territories, in different regions, and ultimately in communities. But what hope is there for countries that seem to advance irreversibly along the pathway to highly industrialized agricultural systems, the type that Graham was describing there? And what are the pathways back? What can we learn ultimately from the farmers and others that you are working with? So, Million, I hope that's not too much complicated question, but what can we learn from your work ultimately?
Yeah, thank you very much for inviting me. Thank you also for forcing me to read the two documents. At least I read the summary, and it was excellent. I think in terms of the report, I like the definition of or differentiation between equity and equality in the HLPE report. And when I was asking myself, why are we as we are, as Africa specifically? I think we can all go back historically to the first arrival of the European ships to Africa and on slavery, and later we were forced to produce for the outside world instead of for the people. That continued through the colonial system, and that continued to post-independence. And the whole system in Africa, I think in each of the countries, is captured by elites, a few elites which have a connection with the military and with other forces in the country. So that creates an inequity into the system necessarily, because some will have the resources, some will have not. If you are closer to the system, you have, and if you are far, you don't. And the majority don't have a closeness to the system. So, and there is no future for the people, especially for the youth. So there is already inequity built into the system. much more into agricultural system, as a majority of our people are base their livelihood on agriculture. And this increasing dependency on green revolution technologies, we know what has happened when there is a war between Ukraine and Russia, as Graham said, that was, the cost of almost everything has risen up in 2, 3, or 4 folds in our country. And that shows you how inequity is built into the system through the green revolution and through the push now by philanthro capitalists like Bill Gates, So that's one of the area of the why inequity is built into the system. To go back to your question, the strategies, I think there is a misunderstanding in the general public and the policymakers that to do agroecology or sustainable food systems is backward. We have done it for thousands of years, tens of hundreds of thousands of years. Why are we going back? Actually, when going forward is not working, there's no problem in going back. But as we know, agroecology is not a backward way of lifestyle. It's a forward because it's based on research, cutting edge research. So we need a really, really good education. We need farmers-led research, research and development, and based on that also we need educating the public, and that's very much important. But what is equally important is also the policy support. We need to give incentives to farmers. It's not easy for a farmer who is using agrochemicals to suddenly switch to agroecology. People think that, why don't you move to agroecology? Moving is not easy. As our farmers say, the land is corrupted, so they need time and they need coverage. When a farmer stops using artificial fertilizers, the soil, I think, is a dead soil. So they need at least 3-4 years to recover their soil. So we need a policy and we need an incentives for that. And also we need extension services, that we need to educate the extension service. Where the extension service exists, they reach the local farmers. And if they support agroecology, I think they can support our farmers. And I think what we have done in AFSA, by the way, my organization is called Alliance for Food Sovereignty in Africa. It's the biggest social movement in Africa, working in 50 of the 55 African countries, over 200 million farmers as a constituency. So it's a big movement. So we have asked ourselves a question: how can we use the forces of the market for agroecological transition? And we have started working on agroecological entrepreneurship program, where we are identifying agroecological entrepreneurs and supporting them, to link farmers and consumers. And there is this has so many benefits. One of them is mobilizing the youth, the African youth. We have plenty of youth. They are jobless, and if they are jobless, they can be really dangerous, for political instability. So we identified that as a really a good space for them. This is a service space. So we are working on that, and we have practice on that. As I speak, we have finished a meeting with 6 countries, where they would be implementing this program. We are also exploring policy spaces. For example, climate change. There are climate UNFCCC policy spaces. The KJWA, Coronavirus Joint Work on Agriculture. Now they call it Sharm el-Sheikh Food Security, Nutrition and Agriculture. And in that, we want agroecology to be reflected, and agroecology to be reflected in so many of our policy spaces. We are working on that, and we are being successful. And we have created also a communities of practice among our farmers. Now we're working more than 20 African countries where farmers actually exchange information on the kind of practice that they're having. We are using also these farmers as centers of excellence for training, for research. And we have linked this community of practice of our farmers with the famous Andhra Pradesh project. And we are working together to really educate the youth and educate the public and disseminate agroecology. I see that you want me to finish, so I stop here. Thank you very much.
That must be telepathy, but thank you so much. And it was, it was really nice to hear about the kind of the beacons of hope in the type of work that you're doing. I mean, if you're working with 200 million farmers and working with youth, but also able to influence some of those global policy for that you mentioned. And I think there's a lot of hope, because we try to, I think in both reports, find the right balance between presenting the situation as it is, which is a failing food system, and in terms of inequity and sustainability and so on, but also focus on these islands of innovation and hope. And so I was going to turn to Anna, actually. So I've found the Food Foundation has been kind of my go-to place for anything on the UK food system and inequalities, and it's been incredible to see the way the organisation is growing in strength over the years. And I wanted to mention coming back to the UK situation. So we talk about one of these islands of hope in the IDS report as being Brighton, where there has been progress on reducing child obesity compared to the national average, and that's been largely due to kind of a very active set of NGOs and public health team in the city working hard, supporting early years against cuts of austerity and so on. But I wanted to ask you, are there other islands of hope within the UK that we can point to and actually start to kind of replicate at a national level, including at that kind of city level or town level that you're aware of?
Thanks. Brighton it's amazing what they're doing in Brighton, and it's down to the Brighton and Hove Food Partnership, which are a really dynamic organisation working across the city. And there are food partnerships actually in, I think it's about close to 90 cities and towns across the UK now, under a broad banner called the Sustainable Food Places Network. Brighton is definitely one of the front runners. There's an award scheme for those sustainable food places, and I think there are just 2 cities that have gold on the award scheme, and Brighton is one of them, Bristol is the other. So lots of good stuff going on in Bristol as well. But there are very many other places where interesting innovations are happening, but they might be very small scale. It might be, for example, I recently visited in Margate and Ramsgate. There's a really interesting social enterprise called Our Kitchen, which runs what would probably be called food pantries. So there's a membership model where you can pay a small membership fee and have access to very low cost groceries, but very unlike a food bank, because it feels like a shop, and you're not referred, it's all under your own. There's not the sort of same levels of stigma that are attached to that. So from very small scale things like that through to other places, I mean, like Birmingham, who have just published a pretty aspirational food strategy for the whole city. We're working very closely with the city council there, and where they're looking at a whole raft of different levers that they can pull to try and improve food environments in the city, whether it's from looking at their procurement contracts for school food, through to thinking about the role of the wholesale market in creating a kind of hub for channeling food surplus to a wider sort of network of charities across the city, through to thinking about how they can use meanwhile spaces and car parks for urban growing and all kinds of interesting things that are happening. I think probably the place to stop is in terms of thinking about how, to what extent can local places be transformative, given that so many of the levers for change in the UK at least reside at the national level. So if you want to do anything that affects the commercial food environment, very difficult to do that in a local place. You're left really with the kind of you might be able to do some work with convenience stores, but beyond that, you're looking at more charitable provision or the sort of alternative food sort of sector rather than the mainstream commercial sector. And of course, all the levers for them reside nationally. I mean, even at the UK level, there's not really any that much influence, even at devolved. I mean, to a degree there is. Wales has introduced interesting stuff today, actually, but there's a bit at the devolved level. But really, you know, the companies themselves are operating UK wide, and you really want to get them to change anything, you've got to do that at the UK level. And similarly, of course, many of the policies then that affect that commercial food environment, which is causing so much trouble, often reside at certainly devolved, if not UK level. So I think we're in a situation in the UK where we are having to undo decades of deep penetration of a commercial food system, which bakes in a lot of these inequalities and bakes in poor health outcomes and poor environmental outcomes. And the extent to which local areas can do that is limited. What local areas are brilliant at doing is creating connection between citizens and food and getting people, whether it's bringing people together to build community around food, whether it's helping people to understand where food comes from and value it in different ways, whether it's cooking for one another, all those amazing things that food can do to transform society. They happen in local communities, and local places are brilliant at enabling those things to happen. And Brighton's a great example of that. So yeah, local places can do good stuff, but it's definitely not an alternative to what needs to happen nationally.
Yeah, thank you so much for that reminder as well. So Graham, I was going to turn to you because I think some of the perspectives on power clearly resonated with your work at CAFOD and CAFOD's kind of long-term perspective on this. So I was just going to ask you, you know, we talked about these kind of policy lock-ins and Gareth mentioned kind of policy deafness. You know, what's the way forward at that kind of policy level to kind of overcome lock-ins that, you know, in your experience and in CAFOD's approach?
So I think the way forward, part of it is campaigning and linking with social movements. We've got a campaign called Fix the Food System campaign that's currently targeting the World Bank. I think in the IDS report, it highlighted some of the concentration of power in both reports very clearly. And we know that the big four kind of grain companies, fertilizer companies, they've got monopolistic control over the market, so much so that the US is starting to look in its anti-competitive practices at the agribusiness sector. And for us, that's not news that the kind of corporations like to control and gain access to market. What we've looked at, we've just done a report on the World Bank on how that entrenches poverty. What's surprising is that the multinational institutions that have a focus on poverty actually are listening much more to big companies and are entrenching the systems that we see, the industrial agriculture system. So our report found that the World Bank continues. Those of you who are old enough to have worked on structural adjustment policies or whatever came after them with the World Bank, new approaches, same approaches, different words. So you've now got your prior conditions, your policy prior conditions, and for many agricultural programs, the prior conditions are that governments introduce seed certification laws and enact various subsidy regimes. And these seed certification laws effectively criminalize small farmers for saving, sharing, and selling seeds that they've used for generations. One was passed in Kenya. I was speaking to our Kenya team earlier today. She was saying that actually you can get 2 years in prison if you save, sell, or share a commercially registered seed. And even if that isn't actually implemented in law, the chilling effect means that most of the farmers, and so 80% of farmers are roughly throughout Africa, are in the informal sector, yet all of the policies are supporting the formal sector and the market growth. So that's the reality. And actually looking at World Bank documents, a lot of their internal documents that we found recognize that these subsidy policies and these seed laws are failing, yet they just carry on implementing them. And it's because the big companies have the ear of the World Bank and they keep on pushing that through. So what can be done? And I think, or maybe my final point on that, there's a lovely expression in the IDS report around, let me find it, that about epic narratives that stick, no matter how misleading they are. And I think that is the case of this industrial agriculture, that we need more, we need to produce more, we need more growth, we need kind of efficiencies of scale, and therefore that's the only way. And so we found even at COP27 in Egypt last year, you had fertilizer companies almost saying, let me tell you, sunshine, you need more food, that's the way, you need more production, that's the way the world works. And that co-option of spaces is what's happening. So what to do? I mean, it's a tricky one, a few things. So we are currently trying to get the World Bank as a cheerleader of this approach to change its policies to stop the conditionality, trying to push the UK government to stop including in trade deals the fact that companies need to sign up to restrictive seed laws. So we're trying to actually just raise awareness of these things that in this room we know about, and it doesn't cut through on policymakers' inboxes. So just trying to show people that actually the consolidation of the market, this idea that we've got great choice, that is based on the consolidation of power. And I think the other thing I'll mention is actually going around back to the first high-level panel, HLPE, high-level panel of experts report in 2011 was touched on food speculation. So after the last food crisis, there was a whole load of recognition that actually concentration of power in who controls the seeds, the trade of seeds, the boats, who controls the market, who can hold back seeds in times of crisis, led to the food price hike around 2007, 8, 9, and actually massively increased poverty. I think the figures were around 200 million extra people were malnourished as a result of that. Now, there's various recommendations came out that haven't been implemented. And the same, we're in Groundhog Day. And actually, so looking at G20 governments, looking at actually enacting legislation that limits excessive food speculation in times of crisis is an obvious one to do, or looking at breaking up monopolies. So actually, looking at the HLP report, it's looking at some of these other systemic inequities that we actually need to tackle. And so I think we need to look where funding goes, but we also need to look at how we're allowing the concentration of power to continue and the legislative approaches that we need in various countries.
So thank you, Graham, for convincing me that you've read the IDS report and also earlier HLPE report. And I think it's really important. And Christina and I are having a conversation at the beginning of the session about how, to a certain sense, both reports to a sense of deja vu, because these inequalities have been persistent for some time, they're historical roots, and we've been exploring some of those roots today. I had a further question for Gareth, but I think what I might do, because we're running short of time, is actually start to open up questions to the floor. And I know that there's been an active discussion by the looks of it on chat and Q&A. Steve and Gary, is there a question I might take from colleagues online? And in the meantime, if people want to formulate their questions in the room, I'd be happy to take it. I think we've got a bit of time, maybe 5 minutes or so for questions from the audience as well. And for those in the room, we'll be having a drinks reception downstairs afterwards, so there'll be time also to chat to us and our panelists then as well. So, Steve. Oh, sorry. Yeah. So, questions online?
Yeah. Go on to
yeah.
Question from Jeff Tansey, who asks, how do you address the problem of regulatory capture by the large players across the food system who are keen to maintain the status quo with all its inequities, from trade rules through to marketing of processed food? So quite a challenging question there, I think.
Yeah, thank you. So what I'm going to do is take a number of questions just to give time for the panelists to have a thought, think about these questions. A very good question there from Jeff. Another question on the room, perhaps. Sorry, if you could just introduce yourself as well, that'd be great.
Sure. Hi, I'm Amy. I work for United Against Malnutrition and Hunger, so Anna, lovely to meet you. And one of the things I'm quite interested in the report is the connection between food systems across low economically developed countries and high income countries. So the kind of the parallels of case studies with Brighton and other countries is quite interesting to me. One of the things that I think the international development sector is quite worried about is pitting the poor in Africa against the poor in the UK. So I'd be interested to hear from panelists how you found putting them next to each other in the reports and how, whether that's a real fear or whether that's something that you've made up.
Thank you. I think Gareth was alluding to some of those kind of the systemic inequities need to be seen as kind of systems connecting with other systems and including the kind of north and south inequities. So we'll take one more question. The gentleman there.
Thank you. My name is Stephen Hicks. My question is about the rural mechanisation dimensions of this, because it seems on the food processing side, you've got a high degree of mechanisation coming in as a problem. And on the production side, you've frequently got the scaling up of agriculture as if that's a solution. So there's a whole debate about rural patterns of rural mechanisation. And I was wondering if in the reports which I haven't, whether there are any examples or cases of policy by governments which have managed to engage with the mechanisation patterns, as it needn't be large scale. There are lots of examples of smaller scale, which has worked. And on the processing side, there will be policies in some countries which have come to grips with some of that. So I'd like to hear from the two report writers.
Fantastic. So we'll take those three questions there. So a question on populations, also on north-south narrative differences and connecting with systems, and then also mechanisation. Okay. So I think I'll open that to panelists and then also Lydia and Christina, if you want to come in as well, that's fine, but I'll just open it up. So does anybody want to be the first to take one of those questions? I
mean, I won't be able to address them all, but on Jeff's question, I mean, I can probably speak to this more from the latter part of your question. And so you were talking about regulatory capture by corporate interest, essentially, and we have plenty of that going on in the UK at the moment. You'll have seen that evidenced in headlines around U-turns on multiple policies in the past couple of years around intervening on junk food, essentially. And I don't think there are any easy solutions in terms of how you deal with that. Obviously, one way is to make the lobbying process more transparent. At the moment, there are various registers which people have to report meetings with ministers and things on. But there are multiple loopholes that have been quite sort of well documented and researched now. But I also think at the moment around food in the UK, we haven't set out really as a nation what our vision for the food system is, how it might transition to deliver better outcomes for us and for the environment that we're in. And should any government, this government is not likely to do that, but any government coming in the future might actually think about the involvement of citizens in that process and building in to the government's arrangements around thinking about food system transformation, what the relative power of different groups, citizens versus corporates, might be, and what the structures are which work against the kind of capture that Jeff's talking about. On the point that Amy said about North and South, it's a really interesting question. And again, I think to some extent the narrative around power and the commercial sort of determinants of outcomes is quite helpful, because it does bring countries together with a kind of common problem, whether those are countries in the north or the south or wherever. And I think that's maybe something to think about a little bit more in terms of where those coalitions of support across different contexts. I mean, I think what's very key, we've done a little bit of work, we did some work where we were creating a partnership between Birmingham and Pune in India. There's a really interesting conversation between the local municipality in Pune and the local district council in Birmingham. And the issues that they were grappling with were very similar, I mean, different in important ways, but the processes that they had at their disposal to make change happen were very, very similar. And that created quite a constructive conversation around, you know, how you can get the right mix of policy interventions going around delivering good dietary outcomes for citizens. So yeah, maybe there's more possibilities through connecting cities and places across the globe more productively. I don't know, thinking around really.
I'll be very brief because I know you're also keen to hear from Lidia and Christina, so there are a few questions to them. Just two thoughts. One, which is what I've seen happening in terms of how to tackle corporate power. One is that many of you will have seen that feedback. I think it has taken UK government support over their food strategy, because they removed all of the things around eating less meat, around animals, around diets, and so actually, and they're doing it from a climate change perspective. So actually being creative around the legal process, using all the mechanisms available. And secondly, I was reading today, and I didn't go into detail, that and others may know more, that in Chile, it seems to be the only country who've introduced very clear legislation around the kind of high fatty, salty and sugary foods in terms of what's available in supermarkets. They've removed cartoons from breakfast cereals, and actually the early evidence shows quite a significant reduction in sugar, salt, fat intake from teenagers and across the board. So I don't know huge amounts about it, but actually it's a chink of hope in terms of when governments want to do something they can.
Thank you. And I was going to turn to our online panelists. So Millian, I see you've got your hand up already, actually. So you may want to answer any of those questions. I don't know if you had an answer to the question on mechanisation there as well, or perhaps that might be something that Lidia might be able to help with as well.
Yeah, thank you very much. There's a lot of echo in the room, so I'm not sure whether I understood the questions very well, especially around rural mechanization. But in terms of regulatory capture, what are you doing is, I can say what we are doing as AFSA, you know. There is a regulatory capture around on our seed laws and regulations. I think Graham spoke about that a while ago, and land capture by big companies, even the local capture is there. So when there is a regulatory capture of the food system happens, what we do is advocacy. For example, one of the instruments in Africa, which is facilitating this capture, is Alliance for Green Revolution in Africa, called AGRA. Agra actually, in a recent evaluation, they say that Agra is very successful, it failed in so many of the things, but in one thing it was successful, which is in facilitating the regular capture of seeds and lands and artificial fertilizers and whatever. So this is happening. So what we have tried is to bleed the support to Agra by countries and philanthrocapitalists. We campaigned for these countries and organizations to support their support to Agra. And the other strategies, we collaborate widely with our partners in the US and in Europe and in other countries to really organize, a joint campaign around this issue. That's what we do. I didn't understand the rural mechanization issue very well. I thought, whether mechanization is needed or not. Is that the question?
But I think there's a question about the kind of historical role, but also kind of government policies in place to support mechanization.
Historical rural government support mechanization.
I mean, I think it's something that we might move on to in the discussion here if the gentleman's okay, because I think we're running slightly out of time, and I just wanted
maybe to Gareth might respond to it. He raised his hand already. Yeah.
Thank you, and thanks very much, Lidia. And Gareth, I just want to kind of give a final word for you, because you've been waiting patiently with your hand up, and I also was going to ask you a question earlier about the kind of role of the right to food in the South African Constitution. So you may want to speak to that, or you may want to speak to a more general point of one of the questions we've been asked. But we'll take your final kind of comments, and then I think we'll have to probably close before Steve and Gary tell me on. So.
Thanks, Nick, and I'll be brief. I think just picking up on the question of the right to food and what it means in South Africa, I think it's always been interpreted as about national government trying to achieve the progressive realization of the right to food has been enacted through the Department of Agriculture. So I want to pick up on a comment that Anna made around needing national and not just having these local. It can't work as singular, and Simon Maxwell and others have commented on this in the chat, and that was what prompted me putting my hand up. So I think and I'm from the African Center for Cities, so my focus is on urban and urban food, and trying to understand African cities through food and how they're changing. But I think what is particularly important is this gap in policy at the urban space. And this is, and some might disagree with my point, but given the high levels of inequity in our colonial histories and the fragmentation of society that we have, assuming models like food policy councils that might work in Bristol or elsewhere would work in African contexts or in Southern contexts, I think need real reflection and real critical kind of consideration, because the inequities of society play out in those same forums that get created. And I think we do still have to hold the state accountable through civil society, through the work that we do in academia and others. And so this holding of the state accountable means for me that local, given our levels of urbanization, have to play a critical role and have to have the necessary policy tools, but also the fiscal tools to allow them to act in these spaces. This is not calling for a sort of localization of the ministries of food. I think the work that the Logic project that we're doing with IDS and others is showing that in cities, the need is very different to what it might be at a regional or county level, or what it might be at a territorial level, or what it might be at a national level. So these reports for me demonstrate how important it is for every one of these different contexts to focus explicitly on sort of the connection between the food system and these multiple other systems that feed into those intersectionalities. And this focus on national is why we don't get the necessary data, why we aren't able to understand what's happening, because we're stuck in these policy structures, they're informed by measurement structures that are aligned to a context that is no longer relevant in the spaces that we're working, in my view. So I think for me, trying to rethink, and what these reports have shown is how policy has to be completely restructured to really act or engage in what is taking place at these specific contexts to be able to respond to those. And to bring multiple actors together in different ways, and not just through the national, but also not just through privileging local is the only way as well. So let me leave it at that. There might be comments from the room.
Thank you, Gareth. That was really helpful and almost a kind of way of summing up, because it really resonates with what Anna was saying also about kind of, there are, islands of hope in the local, but we need to combine this with real changing in power regimes at the national and international levels. And there's been a lot of thoughts from the panelists and from both our speakers on the reports that resonates with that today. So I'm going to have to bring this to a close now. I just wanted to say, I'll come to thanking our speakers and panelists in a second, but I also wanted to thank some of our partners at the Food Equity Centre, many of whom are online today. So we have the Centre for Food Policy at University, CDPA, which is a part of the Universidad Federal de Rio de Janeiro, Centre for Excellence in Food Security at the University of Western Cape in South Africa, and the African Centre for Studies that Gareth is so kindly represented today. I just wanted to kind of flag the role and mission of the Food Equity Centre, which is to generate contextualized knowledge and actionable solutions, contributing to transformative change that leads to equitable and sustainable food systems globally. The purpose of the centre is to provide a network for these kind of conversations between activists, researchers, practitioners globally. And today has been an example of the kind of conversations we want to have. But we're a nascent centre, and we want to broaden and deepen our network. So if you're interested in being kept in the loop and being kept in touch with our work and the work of our partners, we'll be contacting all of those who registered for the event today with details of getting involved in the centre. Or please have a chat with myself or Melissa or Lidia in the break if you're in the room. But it just falls on me to thanks again to our speakers, to Melissa, to Lidia, to Christina, to Million, to Graham, to Gareth, to Anna, but also the people who've been behind the event today. So particularly Steve and Sophie, our very able communications colleagues here at IBS, and to Gareth as well for support on the day. So thank you, everybody. Thank you, everybody, for attending. Please join us downstairs for a drink if you're here in the room, and thanks again. I think we've had about we were up to about 80 participants earlier, so really grateful for those who joined us online as well. Thanks, thank you. Thanks over from us.
Thank you very much. Bye bye.
Thank you, everyone.